and for anybody who's running a company that's listening, they should think this through. Like, I think that what the radical leftists are doing is overwhelmingly unrepresentative of the general population. Yes. Overwhelmingly. But they're a very well-organized and verbal and prepared minority. And they've occupied powerful positions in many, many institutions. HR, and one of the things I really can't figure out right now, and for anybody who's running a company that's listening, they should think this through. Like, to let these postmodern neo-Marxists into your company through the guise of human resources is an absolute catastrophe. You're going to pay for that. The ideology that drives postmodern neo-Marxism, this identity politics, the identity politics movement, and its insistence on equality of outcome is a powerfully anti-capitalistic. It's powerfully anti-Western. Why you would let that into your company is so that you can look good socially, let's say, is beyond me. It's a big mistake.
I agree with you, but I don't think people are aware of it. I think part of the problem is this battleground is largely ignored by the general population. I don't think most people are aware of what's going on. You are, because you're deeply embedded in the university system in Canada, and you're obviously now branching out into YouTube and podcasts and all these different ways to get this information out. But the average person that is a CEO of a company, or they're concerned with their own company. They're concerned with their own individual needs. They're concerned with organizing things and keeping their bottom line and making sure.
They're also concerned with looking fair and making sure that they're not prejudiced and all of that, which is laudable. But
I just don't think they see the wave coming.
No, they don't. They don't see it coming. They don't understand it. And they're incautious about it, but they're going to pay for it. Well, Google is a good example, because now Google is in court on the feminist end for being prejudiced against females, and also on the conservative end for being prejudiced against conservatives. It's like, well, so both camps are after them. And I think, well, why is that? It's like, well, that's what happens when you play identity politics, this tribalism. Now, this is really what I can't stand about identity politics. And I've been warning about the consequences of it on the right wing too, because what I see happening is that as the left, let's say the left gets to define the linguistic territory, which was what I was objecting to in Bill C-16. When it came out, I said, look, I'm not going to use these neologisms, Z and Zer, etc., because as far as I'm concerned, they have nothing
people who don't know what you were talking about, a bunch of different made-up gender pronouns to describe people in a non-male or female way.
That's right. So there's 70 different categories of non-binary gender, something like that, generated now. And there's lists of pronouns that hypothetically the people who are in those categories can choose to be addressed by. And now that has the force of law. And I don't care if they choose to be addressed by those pronouns, whatever. That's up to them and whoever else they can convince or ask or entreat or negotiate with. Fine. As soon as it's law, that's a whole different story. Okay, so now I have to use a certain terminology. So then I look at the derivation of the terminology. I say, oh, that's terminology generated by the postmodern neo-Marxists. Oh, well, I think those people are reprehensibly murderous. So guess what? I'm not going to say their words, period. Because I know what they're like. I know where that leads. Okay, so...
But most people think that that's a gigantic step to go from saying you don't want to say Z or Zer or any of these made-up gender pronouns to these are murderous people.
Mm-hmm. The ideology is murderous.
The ideology being Marxism.
Yeah. And so you say, well, I want to make things fair. And then that's also driven by some real compassion, because nobody really likes that, the consequences of radical inequality. Nobody likes the fact that homeless people exist and have to go to the emergency ward, to get treated, and they don't have medical coverage and they have to live in tents on the street. And so if you have some compassion, then you think, well, we got to do more for the poor and dispossessed. It's like, okay, that's an understandable sentiment. But the problem is that it's that desire to help is contaminated by resentment and ideological certainty, and then also by something that George Orwell pointed out so nicely in his book Road to Whig and Peer. It's like the typical middle-class socialist, this was his diagnosis, and he was a socialist, by the way. His diagnosis was the typical middle-class intellectual socialist doesn't like the poor. In fact, they don't want to have anything to do with the poor. They're contemptuous of the poor, but they hate the rich. And I think it's even more devious than that, because I think who they hate are the successful. some of the successful are rich, but really who they hate is the successful. It's like Cain and Abel. It's the retelling of Cain and Abel. And so there's some positive motivations for being engaged on the left, and there's a lot of negative motivations as well. And the people who are really driven by the radical left ideology, the real radicals, they're almost all driven by resentment and hatred, as far as I'm concerned. So if you're a creative type who's kind of disorderly, then you're likely to be on the liberal left end of the distribution. And if you're a non-creative type who's orderly and especially if you're orderly, then you tend to be on the right wing end of things. And so, well, why is that? Why do those variations exist? Well, they exist because some of the time your best strategy is to do what other people have done and shut the hell up and just do it. Run the algorithm, right? The pathway's already laid clear. It works. Stay in the damn rut and move forward. Okay, so that's the conservative approach. And when things are going right, it's the right approach. The problem is that sometimes it's not the right approach because something has shifted. And so something new has to emerge. And so then there's a bunch of people who are adapted to the new. And those are the entrepreneurial and creative types. And of course, they dominate Silicon Valley because it's a very entrepreneurial, what would you call it? Geography. And so they're going to lean to the left. But they have to understand, people have to understand that the left and the right need each other. The liberals and the conservatives need each other. Liberals start companies. Conservatives run them. And the problem with the conservatives is, well, they can only run a company in one direction because they're conservative. They don't think outside the box. But so if the company is working and the product line is good and everything is stable, like hire some conservatives because they'll maximize efficiency and they'll move down that track. But if the track is no longer going in a good direction because something's changed, the environment's changed, well, then you got to bring in the creative people. And so we need each other. And the only way that we can survive the fact that we're different and the fact that we need each other is by continually talking. We have to talk constantly. It's like, well, how much of what we're doing should we preserve versus how much of what we're doing should we transform? And the answer is, well, we don't know because the environment keeps changing. So what do we do about that? We talk.